In Fresno, California, June 1st of 1987, a woman would go missing under some fairly unusual circumstances, but at the same time, it would appear like it was a fairly open and shut case. As time passed, an arrest would be made, but ultimately the man would be turned free, utilizing the defense of Bigfoot took her. Despite this preposterous notion that this could have been the case, the woman would remain missing and nothing would actually ever be found of her or even hint at where she may have gone. Also, I need to put in like a bit of a disclaimer in this. There is some mention of some pretty dark things happening to the younger population involved in this video, which sheds light on the reason why certain decisions and outcomes kind of came about, which I'll actually bring my wife into this because she has her master's in clinical mental health and all that good stuff. So if that's not really something that you want to hear about, I do have plenty of other videos and podcasts that do not get into that sort of thing, so feel free to check them out. But as time passed and the case would continue to grow colder, the police would become increasingly desperate to try to figure out what happened to this woman. Despite having the guy she was last seen with and his absolutely just chef's kiss of an ironclad defense, it seemed as though their hands were tied. Years would go by and still nothing would turn up and no arrests would ultimately be made. Y'all ever watch Wendigoon? I think it was like the Pizza Heist episode where he mentions that the cops refused to search the skeleton pile, only to do so months later and find an actual skeleton. This is literally the case in a nutshell. So today's episode, let's discuss the absolutely insane disappearance of an adolescent named Theresa Bier and her apparent abduction by a group of Bigfoot in the Sierra Nevada mountains. But before jumping into that, we passed 100,000 subscribers, which as always, thank you guys for your awesome support on these videos. If you find yourself enjoying these type of videos and you want to subscribe, my initial deal still stands. The Michigan Dogman shows up every decade, ending with 7, and if this channel gets to 1 million subs by 2027, I will quite literally go up to Michigan and look for the Michigan Dogman. I have been building my Forerunner as an overlanding rig for just such a purpose, and I'm always looking for an excuse to travel somewhere. Also, all these videos are uploaded in podcast format to Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Podcast Stuff, all the major ones in case you don't want your phone battery just absolutely destroyed. It can be found under Real Horror with Roanoke Tales. Regardless of that, thank you for checking out this channel, and let's get into the mysterious disappearance that really just casts light on the darker side of human nature. The concept of desensitization is something that is a very well-known phenomenon. Working at a local city dump, well, eventually you'll go nose blind to the smell. Working in a factory in July that's around 100 degrees like I used to, which I'm pretty sure violates multiple OSHA standards. Eventually, you won't notice the heat. Dealing with crappy situation after crappy situation, well, eventually your mind will adapt to protect itself from the reality that you face to the point that it really doesn't bother you all that much anymore. This type of mental reconditioning is seen in victims of horrible events that I won't even mention here, but you can use your imagination. The brain will attempt to protect itself from the horrors of the world, and in doing so, a new reality is created for that individual. In some ways, that can be good for them, but in other ways, it can create a perfect storm of neglect and poor decision-making that can lead to someone going missing, never to be seen again. Theresa Bier is someone who did not have a good life as short as it appears to be. While no signs were ever truly found of her, from the time that she was little to the time that she would head up into the mountains for the last time, she had about as bad as a run of luck that you could possibly imagine. Born to parents Shirley and David Bier, things were not going so well from the drop. While the father may not have been implicated, it's kind of unknown that he was actually involved in any of these processes, the mother was quite abusive to her and her siblings on a regular basis. And see, this is the stuff that honestly makes me slack-jawed when it comes to people. Like, yeah, there's an argument of human morality and whether a person is ready to have offspring, but, I mean, all I'm saying is if you're guilty of doing stuff like this, there is no coming back. Feel free to, plead the case, but I suppose I don't really care. Face the wall, please. But essentially, the mother would treat her younglings pretty horrendously, but Theresa may have gotten the brunt of it. One night in Fresno, California, when Theresa was roughly around 3 or so, she would be severely injured by her mother, if you can call her that. And let me just break character for a moment. I know I put like a lot of disgust in the feeling and statements involving this subject matter. It just makes my blood boil. I'm very much so human, and I very much so hate injustice. And I mean, this is, my channel, so I'm gonna tell you about how I hate it. Anyways, Shirley would wrap Theresa's leg around a crib slat and began twisting it until it broke. Once completed, she would then go on to attack her to the point of breaking several ribs. And see, again, that's a nice time to use face the wall, heathen. That needs apply here. So because of this, Theresa would end up in the hospital where she would actually develop an identifying scar for the rest of her life that if you check the missing persons report now, that is still a way to make sure that she is who she says she is, if she ever turns back up, but I don't think that's going to be happening. So if you are imagining, well, that's a bit of a rough start, well, it continues to get worse, culminating into the aforementioned perfect storm. The government would then actually do something correct at this point. Shocking, I know. Social services would step in and take the entire ensemble away from the parents due to the just horrendous living conditions. They would then be taken and placed into foster care, and due to the shake-up of the family structure, the parents would split up. Now again, it is unknown if David knew what was going on or was involved in any of this, but due to the timing, I can only imagine that he may have split ways from Shirley because he discovered this was going on. One of the actually high moments of Theresa's life would be when she was taken in by a woman named Sylvia Pierce, who was a friend of the church at the time. It appears she would take in the other sister known as Vicky, and a few years would pass by and things were going pretty good. However, it was around this time that the old man wanted to get them back and start raising his family. I'm guessing he figured that, they were good to go at this point because he was already divorced from Shirley. Well, good to go they weren't, because he was now married to a woman named Margie Richmond, and Dad sure knew how to pick 'em. And by pick 'em, I mean sift through the medical waste at the hospital and choose the worst person imaginable. Being yanked out of a stable home, she was then brought back into it along with her sister, just into this craptacular situation. And the very odd part of this whole situation is known that Margie had been married to Shirley's half-brother, John Richmond, which now resulted in a blended family from Margie's original daughters that came from John and now the daughters that came from David. Well, this all seems horrible because it appears everyone is related to everyone else in some form or fashion. At this point, the father would be granted custody of his daughters, where they would move to Southern California, where Theresa and her sister would also still not fare very well. Margie was reported to have been just about the same as Shirley in a lot of ways, except instead of it being physical, she would play a lot of mind games. See, there's this thing about getting bigger. On the one hand, you deal with a lot less of the physical problems, but the mind games start to come into play more regularly. Margie was reported to have basically locked the fridge and then eat in front of the younglings, to which they were not allowed to eat. This would largely just be another notch on the belt of desensitization for Theresa. Some time would pass, and eventually Theresa would then leave that set of events and return back to Fresno to live with her great-grandmother. Seems like the end, right? Nope. Shortly after getting there, her uncle named John Blind Johnny Richmond, the ex-husband of Margie, would be granted custody of her. Now, he wasn't like an all-bad dude, but it seems like in a lot of ways... Actually, scratch that. I just remembered something. No, he's an all-bad dude. But he was also a few fries short of a Happy Meal in one way or another. First, Blind Johnny claimed that he lost his eyesight playing Russian roulette. How you even have your brain in your head after losing that game is beyond me, but others claimed that he could actually see. This apparently was a site of controversy in this area. Blind Johnny also was questionable concerning morality. While his female offspring lived with his ex-wife Margie, whose husband was now David as a refresher, he had 2 sons with a prostitute who lived with him and now had access to David's daughter as she was living with him because he had custody. But it continues to get worse, because here's the thing. Like, I get it, you gotta have the youngling under adult supervision. Also, I call them that, again, because the normal moniker that we all use to describe what younglings are, YouTube will turn off my comments again, and it takes like 3 weeks to get them back, turned on. So, yeah, that's why I'm calling them this if you're curious. So as I was saying, so this guy somehow got priority custody of Theresa, even though it was known at the time, despite the whole prostitute thing, which was still a little bit of a head-scratcher, that he had an 18-1-year-old girlfriend named Tamara Newman who lived with him. Bro, how did the great-grandmother lose custody? This doesn't make any sense. So, why is the government called the government? Well, for this exact reason. Moving on. So things would then go about as good as the rest of this gal's existence was going at this point. She was forced to babysit John's sons around this time, and it's also claimed that while that was going on, John and his friends would engage in activities with her that usually, if the father were to figure out, would warrant having a serrated edge shoved into their brainstems. I'll let you fill in the missing info there. But all this would obviously have an impact on the actual mental development of this woman, and when trauma like this happens, it can actually result in things like developmental issues as the brain goes into protection mode rather than properly forming. I actually talked to my wife about this before I wrote it, and she has a master's in clinical mental health, as mentioned earlier, and she's done some studying on this, so I'm going to bring her in so that she can talk about the actual consequences of trauma and what happens in the developing human brain, like right now.
Okay, hey, this is Erica. I am an associate professional counselor and I am Roanoke's wife. He asked me to come on here today and talk to you guys a little bit about how trauma can affect a developing brain. So he actually walked upstairs and he goes, hey, can you give a off the top of your head summary of how trauma can affect the brain? I looked at him and I said, well, I can do a PowerPoint. So he said, well, that's probably not needed here, but I can definitely have you come on and talk about that. And that's one of my favorite topics, so I'm really excited to share with you guys today. So as always, this is not a comprehensive overview. This is just simply a little bit of a bullet point informational about how trauma can affect a developing brain. So let's get right into that. So trauma can affect a developing brain in a lot of multifaceted, a complex number of ways, and there is no one singular way trauma affects a developing brain. We can't really separate a cascading effects of trauma on an individual, a family system, and their community as a whole. Trauma affects systems as well as the individuals who operate day to day within these systems. So the effects of trauma largely really depends on the kind of traumatic event. This can be complex trauma or a singular traumatic event. Complex trauma, it's a really large overarching term that essentially means there are multiple traumatic events back to back in an individual's life. I don't want to say Google it, but we would take up way too much time on that today. So let's just go on from separating complex trauma to singular trauma. This also depends on the environment that the individual is in and the biological factors that they're operating with. This also includes epigenetic factors, their resiliency, family and community support, and their access to resources. The age of the individual also really impacts the effects of trauma on the brain, their socioeconomic status, their access to healthcare and education, and so on and so forth. Trauma largely affects psychosocial development, and please see Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development for more. This includes trust versus mistrust, in which our basic virtue of hope is formed. This is at 0 to 1.5 or 1.5 years of age. Autonomy versus shame, and our basic virtue here is will, and this is at 1.5 to 3 years of age. Initiative versus guilt, and our basic virtue here that's being formed as purpose, and this is 3 to 5 years of age. Industry versus inferiority, which is our virtue here is competency, which is 5 to 12 years of age. Identity versus role confusion, and this virtue here is fidelity, which is 12 to 18 years of age. Intimacy versus isolation, and our basic virtue here is love, and this is 18 to 40 years of age, so really large time span here. The next one is generativity versus stagnation, which is care for the self and an individual, which is 40 to 65 years of age. And then our last one is integrity versus despair, and our basic virtue is wisdom, and this is 65 onto the completion of the lifespan of the individual. Trauma can also halt and even damage developing brains in multiple areas, if not affecting all areas of brain development, sometimes halting development under extreme circumstances such as duress. In developing brains, we can see noteworthy effects on the prefrontal cortex, which is our decision-making, processing, higher-level order, and functioning area of our brain that isn't fully formed until around 26 to 25 years old. That is being debated currently. As well as our hippocampus, which is memory, processing, and coding, hot versus cold memory, and just memory in general. Our pituitary gland, which is our basic functioning, and the amygdala, and this is a big one. This is our alarm system. Physical trauma cases. Brain injuries from concussions are common. This affects neuron health and neurochemistry as well. Trauma also affects our second brain, the gut, and can permanently alter our digestive system. This is important because a lot of neurons are actually found and formed in our gut. Trauma also affects our ability to interact with other human beings, form and maintain relationships, and overall functioning in areas of attention to activities of daily living. Trauma can alter perception, processing, personality, genetics, and even our own DNA. Trauma can start and even be the cause of many recognized mental health disorders, including the following. So these lists are separated that I've compiled for you guys. The first list that I'm about to go over, trauma, what this basically means is that trauma can be the cause of and even begin to start some of those symptoms that we see in a lot of these disorders. And these disorders are anxiety. This includes social, separation, and generalized anxiety disorders. Depression, so this can be just our normal major depressive disorder, or this can cause dysthymia, or otherwise known as persistent depressive disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, panic disorder, eating disorders, including anorexia, bulimia, elimination disorders, personality disorders, and this is the core of all personality disorders, including cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C disorders. Conduct disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, reactive attachment disorder, largely a lot of these attachment disorders that go hand in hand with personality disorders. Dissociative disorders, such as dissociative identity disorder, brief psychotic disorder, otherwise known as psychosis, and substance abuse disorders. And again, this is not a complete list. This just kind of highlights some of the things that trauma can be found at the core of some of these disorders. Trauma can also exacerbate and even cause the expression of genetic or organic disorders, regarded as disorders that we can inherit from our parents and are passed down to us through genetics and biology. This is where we get into epigenetics. And so this means that trauma can cause the expression of some of these symptoms of learning disorders, most commonly language processing disorders. If we want to know more about that, we need to look at the effects of trauma and language on the brain and language processing. Things like dysgraphia, dyslexia can also be exacerbated by trauma. Neurocognitive disorders such as autism and ADHD, schizophrenia, developmental disorders, schizoaffective disorder, schizophreniform disorder, bipolar disorder, cyclothymia, intellectual disability, and OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. These are just some of the highlights. So if you'd like more information on trauma, I would really strongly recommend Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman and The Body Keeps the Score by Bissell van der Kolk. Again, I hope this was informational, and if you guys want more, I would be more than willing to do a bit longer of a talk on this, and please reach out if you want more resources on trauma. This was kind of a spur of the moment, hey, can you do a quick talk on this? And so I was typing kind of furiously. I'm not the most comfortable speaking into a microphone or public speaking. That is definitely an area of development for me. But I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope that this was at least a little bit understandable. And thank you for letting me come in and rant on one of my favorite topics. So you guys have a wonderful day, and I will see you on the next one.
Yeah, she is very smart, and this is exactly why I chose biology, because she's not good at it, and I am, and so we can have two separate interests. Anyways, it's sort of interesting, actually, how she chose the psychological aspect concerning the human brain, and I am all about the natural aspect and its physical structuring. Literally nature versus nurture, psychology versus biology type of scenario. So, with all this, Theresa was described as a slow learner, but physically she progressed in a normal range for her age, being around 5'5" and weighing 110 pounds, and for all those heathens using metric, that comes out to 165 centimeters and 49.9 kilograms. So a fairly lithe person for their height. Now the issue with, well, her entire lifespan or the issues contained within, this created a perfect storm as mentioned earlier. Every close adult to her did not appear to really view her as living and a breathing person. She was really just treated more like a lamp. An absolute failure on the older people's part of her life would culminate into setting into motion the most ridiculous set of events that somehow resulted in nothing being done to rectify it, but instead would just leave us with another missing person. Around this time in early June of 1987, which is literally June 1st, Theresa would go to her friends Peggy and Janice and tell them about a man that she had recently met up with and had this terrible idea. This trip would involve her missing school, which usually this is when, I don't know, maybe the friends would step in and tell a parent, but considering everyone in this town seems to be related, I feel like maybe they wouldn't even grasp how dire of a situation this is. Now, that's a bit hyperbolic, I suppose, but, I mean, not everyone was related, but everyone appeared to be making choices for this young woman that were definitely worthy of being called inbred. Anywho, this man that Theresa would go off with was a 43-year-old painter named Skip. You may notice the age gap here. Well, that presents the first alarming issue when Skip's daughter would also be questioned later, but we'll get there. Skip was something of a liar and a giant douchebag from what I can gather, and that's just my opinion on him. But he would take up the endeavor of finding Bigfoot and became absolutely enthralled with this idea. Not only just being enthralled, but he would also claim that he had seen Bigfoot and Sasquatch many times over the course of his life. But not only that, Skip also was a meth enjoyer. I bet he has seen Sasquatch, or at least he thought he did. But because of these delusions, it would cause him to full-heartedly agree with his own mind that he had seen things and in no way could have been connected to his drug use. So you guys also seem to enjoy my discussion over biology about your heart stopping due to the effects of extremely cold water. So since I also enjoy talking about that, let's get to the idea, or at least the physical ramifications of what meth does to the actual brain of a person, because there is some pretty profound issues that develop alongside its usage. So the first thing to note about this type of drug is that obviously it's highly addictive. For a lot of people, even using it one time can result in a lifelong addiction, and there's a reason for that. When you first try this substance, the first thing it does is cause a massive amount of dopamine to be released into the reward system of the brain. The reward system of the brain is called the mesolimbic system. This system exists just behind the prefrontal cortex or frontal lobe and extends all the way down to the amygdala, hippocampus, and other areas of the limbic system. These neurons are known as midbrain dopamine neurons, and their job is to release dopamine when you do something that helps you survive. Making a kill during a hunt, dopamine. Reproducing, dopamine. Buying a 1967 Impala and putting an LS3 engine into it with 430 horsepower and burning out for the first time since replacing that worn-out 350 engine, massive amount of dopamine. But this is also what this drug hijacks, which is what makes it so addictive. Once inhaling the substance, or really just having it introduced into your body in several different ways, it will force your brain to release a massive amount of stored dopamine, putting you in a trance of euphoria. This neurochemical should typically enter the synaptic gap between neurons to signal to the next neuron, and then some will kind of undergo the process of reuptake, while the rest is recycled elsewhere, but the process is very concise. With meth, this massive push of dopamine causes the other neuron to form more dopamine receptors due to the sudden influx, and not to mention it'll also just completely deplete your dopamine reserves, which this will have mood consequences once you don't have the substance anymore. This essentially can leave a person in a depressed state, as the normal amount of dopamine can no longer trigger the next activation of the following neuron, and in general, your neuron is just depleted. And with this, other feel-good neurochemicals such as serotonin will be used up, and this can actually have a neurodegenerative effect on the brain as a whole, leading to damage that the person may actually not really recover from. And speaking of this neurodegenerative issue, this substance will just outright destroy cells within the brain as well. Two main cells are impacted, and that's the glial cells and the myelin cells. For your brain to operate, there is something also known as the myelin sheath, and this helps speed up electrical impulses by insulating the axon down the cell to the axon terminal to communicate with the dendrites to the next neuron. But an issue arises when the glial cells are attacked. Their job has them aiding in the signaling capacities, fighting infections, and developing the literal myelin cell system. When you take this substance that can outright destroy these cells due to the drug itself and the neurotoxic downstream effects, with these cells being burned through areas like the prefrontal cortex, which if you remember is very close to the reward system that is being overextended, struggle with these effects can lead to a person to have issues with thinking abstractly, paying attention, and a decrease in their ability to make good judgment calls or even plans. And we will see all of this with Skip. The area of the brain, specifically this area of the brain, is critical for putting the human ability in our actions, and that's what separates us from literal animals. Myelin cells give us an idea as to why this is actually happening as well. There are two types of matter in the brain, as it's colloquially called: white matter and gray matter. White matter is responsible for cells communicating, and gray matter is responsible for processing. The substance at hand would cause the signaling between neurons to break down, as the central nervous system would start struggling with communication failures. This can lead to brain damage, like literal brain damage in general, as the body must contend with this mounting issue. Communication is integral to the brain and how it operates, so much so that if you, say, sever the hemispheres of the brain by cutting the corpus callosum, it will be almost like there are two people in the brain itself, as one will answer you when you ask them a question, and it'll just, say something, right? It'll make up a lie as to why you're holding something. And then the other hemisphere will then make up a lie, trying to explain why you just said that. Maybe one day I'll have to discuss that on this channel, or maybe the main channel, as to why this is the actual case. But the last effect neurologically, before getting back into this story, is that the neurotoxic effects on the brain as a whole are pretty bad. Because it isn't just literally going to attack your brain and the substance itself as soon as it clears, everything's good to go, but there are lingering effects associated with it. an increase in the amount of glutamate calcium has been noted in those who are chronic users. This substance in general damages dendrites, which are attached to the neuron cell body, which they are the ones receiving neurochemicals in the synaptic gap. And with this damaged, it will now prevent proper communication, and this has led both to cognitive and motor function issues, and considering the axon of the following neuron is also struggling, you can kind of see how issues begin to mount and why this guy would believe he saw a literal Bigfoot. And that's right, I'm staking my claim. Out of all the Bigfoot stories I've read, there's been one thing that's always conveniently left out and likely to protect the integrity of the story. What was the person using when they saw the Bigfoot, or were they altered in any way, shape, or form? Now, again, deal still stands, Michigan Dogman. Let's see if we can get there. But moving on back to old Skip and why he's a horrendous individual. His full name was Russell Shelton Welch. He lived in Fresno area for quite some time and was able to survive by living off disability checks, and as mentioned, was just straight up addicted to meth. The level of need for this substance was also so high that apparently his wife Shannon had succumbed to an overdose sometime prior, leaving him a widower. Now, it's not known if the wants of Skip were a result of the influence by the substance in his system, or if that was just 100% naturally homegrown, but given how horrible everyone else appears to have been around Theresa, I'm guessing this was just par for the course. On June 1st, 1987, Skip would arrive at Blind Johnny's house because they actually knew one another. Surprise, surprise, who could have predicted that? And apparently he would go on to notice that Theresa was getting ready for school. This 43-year-old meth addict would then offer to drive her to school, and Blind Johnny was like, yeah, okay, that sounds good to me, because honestly, he's just as bad. The thing, though, was that this was planned out prior, so this chance encounter, Theresa and him had already gotten together, and she planned to skip school that day and then go hang out with Methy McGee. After some time later in the morning, Blind Johnny would receive a call from Central High School informing him that Theresa hadn't really arrived at school that day. Now, probably not out of concern for her and really just for himself, because his babysitter would be taken away from him if she got pulled into the system again, and also maybe his friends wouldn't talk. God, that is horrible. Anyways, this is just speculation on my part, but I don't really think the dude cared about Theresa. He would then go on to tell the school that, she was at home sick for the day, and then went looking for her. He would then go on to speak to her friends and acquaintances, and none of them really seemed to know where she went. But you know what was really odd? Despite nobody apparently knowing where she had run off to, all of them would go on to inform Blind Johnny that Skip was not a trustworthy person. Now, it may have been that Blind Johnny said that, she got a ride earlier in the day from Skip, but everyone offering the same statement, which apparently was unprompted, yet not knowing anything about where she went, seems a little odd. Late that night, around 9:30, Blind Johnny would officially report that Theresa had gone missing to the police. Meanwhile, just a few hours prior to being reported missing, Skip and Theresa had made a stop-off at Skip's daughter's house, Chandra. The car that they were driving, a 1976 Monte Carlo, was having some issues, so they had to stop off and make some repairs before heading to the mountains. Now, here's the thing. Chandra knows that her dad was sketch as all get out, but rather than warning Theresa, she just sort of let her go. And don't feel bad for Chandra, because she's about as bad as her father in this scenario, so the apple don't fall far from the tree. After the repairs were made, Skip and Theresa would then head to the Sierra Nevada mountains near Shut-Eye Park. With this information, the police would then begin questioning people in the area where they came across a young woman named Michelle Ryan. Speaking to Skip's family and friends, they would recount that the previous summer, Skip had lured another woman into the mountains in the same way, but this time apparently Chandra advised against it because, well, she knew her father. Once taking them up there, he had a usual MO of getting them to take a similar substance that he would take, and then get them to engage in activities that usually result in young. Michelle had the same thing happen to her, but she was able to make it back home, as apparently she had gone with two male friends as well, but she also believes she had been altered in some form or capacity. As the police kept speaking with Skip's daughter and son, they also got information from Chandra that Skip and Theresa had stopped by and visited that day, that Chandra, though, couldn't identify who it was, but just that there was a young woman in the front of the car. 4 days later, on June 5th, a police officer would then go on to spot Skip's 1976 Monte Carlo by a trailer park near North Fork, which was the town that was located in the foothills of the mountains, suggesting that he was somewhere in the area. This was explained that Skip had come down from the mountains alone and visited a friend named Dorothy Davis, and while down there, he would go on a rant and apparently was distraught that the young woman that was with him had been taken by a group of satanic cult members. Big if true, man. He would then say that she was being kept in the Sierra, where Dorothy then caught on very quickly that he was clearly delusional because his brain was heavily influenced and in an altered state at this point in time. Call the cops! From here, the case gets more complicated. While sitting at home a few days after this, which if you think there would be a manhunt for Skip by now, I guess you would be wrong, Blind Johnny would then receive a threatening call from a young female. She would go on to tell Blind Johnny that Skip was packing and ready to start stacking. That's the phrase I use, but basically it's the same thing. He was told that if he continued to make trouble for him, you will have more trouble from him. Even your kids could get hurt, and that Blind Johnny should tell the police that Skip had taken Theresa to school, dropped her off, and then some unknown blonde girl had picked Theresa up. Well, that's a foolproof plan, but I'm fairly certain at that point I'd be picking up the old equalizer and going to pay my friendly neighbor over there, Skip, a visit. Look, I get it. Johnny didn't really care about Theresa, but threats like that need to be met with action, is all I'm saying. So after this really dumb threat, another 5 days would pass where they would find Skip at his mother's house in Sunnyside, Fresno, where he was actually arrested for a previous drunk driving violation. So, open and shut, right? They got him, right? Everything's good. Well, then the story would just completely change. Drug usage, missing people, intimidation, all this. Just prepare to be enraged. During the ensuing interrogation, Skip continued to go on tangents about Bigfoot, which was probably pretty anger-inducing. He claimed that there were actually a large number of Bigfoots, a large number of Sasquatches in the mountains and living within the caves therein, and he had communicated with them several times. Okay, so here's a man mentioning caves and hallucinations. I want you to put a pin in that statement right there. During this interrogation, his story would change several times, and eventually he would go on to insist that Theresa's name was Sam for some reason. And I'm guessing that it's said that this is a nickname that he gave her, and I'm thinking that probably it was to show that they were close or something, to throw off suspicion from himself. Again, seems like he got a really stupid plan there. So his story would go on from claiming that at first he dropped her off at school, but then he admitted later that the two did in fact go to the mountains to seek Bigfoot. So that's strike one. Then Skip would go on to say that Sam ran off into the woods with another young woman for reasons unknown, which was strike two. Then he changed it into, well, actually she left with a group of campers that I've never seen before. So strike three. So this story would then progress into how Sam got overexcited and ran after Bigfoot that then she saw a couple times that day, and by the end of it, I mean, maybe there's some truth to, like, they thought they saw Bigfoot because they were both higher than kites, and then one time she ended up running off, and then she was just never seen again. But then strike four would come into play. While all this was going on unprompted and not even being questioned about it, Skip would go on to say, oh, but don't worry, if you find Theresa, there will be no sign of S3X abuse. He then added that Theresa was definitely into him anyhow, and that she wanted to hook up with him, but that was really not in his nature to do so. Okay. That's... what? So by the time the authorities began to suspect that maybe, just maybe, there was some sort of foul play here, to which Skip agreed to then take the authorities to the campsite that apparently he and Theresa had allegedly stayed at when she went missing. Leading them to a small grove of trees in the meadow's edge near Browns Creek, there was an interior area of the grove that still had a smoldering fire. Now that might sound odd, but remember, it's been several days at this point. The fire would not be smoldering anymore, and yet miraculously there it was. And also, on top of this, the fire itself appeared damp still, as if someone just a few hours prior had put the fire out. Blankets in the area were seemingly arranged in such a way and configuration intentionally. A camera, purse, bra, and t-shirt were also found, along with pictures of the countryside and a picture of Skip playing guitar as he was sitting by one of the literal pictures with the blanket placed in that exact position, which means it was probably taken just a few hours prior. And there were also pictures confirming that Theresa was with him and they were together up there. Again, open and shut, right? Of course not. Despite the police coming to the conclusion that the campsite had 100% been staged and the actual backgrounds of the photos of Theresa indicate that she was not in that area, Skip wasn't immediately arrested on site and accused of everything. The deputies, however, were able to ascertain that, again, given the background of the photos, that the real campsite was about 20 miles away in Ghost Canyon, so the meadow and canyon would both be searched for evidence of Theresa. Now, I have to break in here because I already know how this ends, because I've already read it, but my God, you have all of this evidence. All of this. Whether it's circumstantial or not, this is basically this guy is lying. They would find drugs later. All of this. It just seems very clear to me what happened, and I'm sure it seemed clear to these deputies as well, but we'll get into that. A search would be launched for Theresa to find anything that was left of her, where on a hillside above Browns Creek, they would then find a blue shirt. Upon investigation, they would determine it was Skip's shirt and it had meth in its pocket, which that should be no surprise to anyone. Bloodhounds would then be brought into the surrounding area, but after so much time had passed, it was really tough to get a scent, and only one thing would be found in one area, but it was for an exceedingly short period of time, and then, I mean, her scent was found, that's about it, nothing else. Her clothes, anything, nothing was found. Skip would officially then, finally, be charged with endangerment of a young adult. God, this is stupid that I have to say this, and young adult stealing. He would then be arraigned in and then released on his own recognizance by the judge. However, another judge had actually initially increased Skip's bail after reviewing the case to $30,000, which the second judge did not know, so 2 days later, after being let out, he was rearrested. So, are you ready for things to go off the rails? Because I sure hope so. 3 days before Skip's trial, they would offer him one of the most ridiculous, just lenient sentences in the world. They dropped the young adult stealing charge and offered him, or at least offered to recommend him for a 1-year sentence if he would just sign a waiver which allowed them to go forward with murder charges if they find Theresa's body and he took them to it. Meaning, if he did in fact take her out, he was going to get 1 year. But even with this, he said, no, I'm not going to do it. It was Bigfoot that took them, and maybe it's because, again, they only had circumstantial evidence and nothing really hard linking him, but I'm pretty sure if you got this in front of a jury, this guy was done so. So the prosecution decided that they were going to save the charge for when a body was found because they wanted to avoid double jeopardy, and that's a concept where you cannot be charged twice with the same crime. So their plan was to wait and get him later. Theresa and Bier was quite literally never found though, so charges on him were never picked back up. Literally, he walked out as a free man because the justice system, if you didn't know, is a little broken from time to time. It handles and operates like a concrete fridge. All of this, the story changes, the drug usage, the lack of parental oversight is what led to a permanent disappearance of this young woman. What's even worse is Skip's family still defended him. I mean, I suppose that's normal, but they continued to basically say the rhetoric of, oh, it was speed freaks that took her out. Even Chandra changed her story and defended her father, saying that he wasn't actually a predator at all. He just had poor judgment, and bringing a young woman to the mountains was not really a good plan. She just completely went back on saying what she said her father was. So what was the actual conclusion to this event? Well, first, I think we can say the cops and justice system botched this one hard. The parents botched this one hard. The friends botched this one hard. Everyone in connection to Theresa botched this one hard. Blind Johnny would go on to die of cancer in 2008, while Skip would die of coronary heart disease in 1998 at the age of 54. Bro, you've got to be kidding me with that. You know, there's a phrase that has been used around me one time that I firmly believe in. Everyone believes that like cops in the judicial system are there to protect you. Not so. Your first line of defense is always yourself. Justice is sought after you are gone, and unfortunately, cops are there just to zip up the body bag. That highlights the importance of staying strapped, and this is not to put anything on Theresa as she was a youngling, so it's not like she would have known this, but this is just advice for everyone who's listening currently. So personally, I think the devil's in the details. As Skip mentioned, a group of big feet in the mountains, in the caves, are what took her. I believe they probably entered a cave together where they were hallucinating, and Skip may have thought that she was actually a Bigfoot and attacked her, and there's a lot of rocks in the cave. He also would say that he was communicating with them. He was probably just talking to her. He may have realized after he had hit her with a rock or something about what he had done, and then carried her further back into the cave where she would never be found so that he could really hide her, and that's where she is to this day. The cops, however, would be unlikely to be able to search all the caves in this area, and that's why, to this day, I think she's never been found. But anyhow, that was depressing, but it's better to know how things work than to just believe that they work one way, which could get you into trouble. So if you enjoy, leaving a like would be fantastic, and subscribing lets the algorithm know that I'm doing a good job at bringing you guys fun and engaging content. So, you know, hey, why not go ahead and hit the subscribe thing? I don't know, if you want to. Anyhow, that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next time.